Okay, just to let everyone know, we are fully live on the live stream. Welcome to the live stream participants and welcome to the TCWG members. We're going to get started in about 1 minute here. Kathleen, you ready to go? What do you think? Okay. Welcome, everybody. Welcome, everybody. Just as a reminder, this is being streamed live, and we're also recording for our note-taking purposes. If you're having any technical difficulties, please email my colleague Tess, and her email address is twendell@rawstrategic.com. That goes both for the live stream folks and for the folks online here. If you go to the next slide, Susan. So for the public participation, if you are in the Zoom meeting now, and I don't think there's anyone in the Zoom meeting, we ask that you watch this via the live stream, and we're going to have public comment at 11:45, and we will provide the Zoom information on how to get in here to provide the public comment at that point. And as I mentioned before, if you're having any technical difficulties, please email Tess. I'm going to quickly review the agenda, and then Kathleen, I'll come to you to welcome and open the meeting. What we're hoping to do today is we're going to start with a conversation around overburdened communities, and the real question for the group is how you want overburdened communities and the relationship to the work that this group is tasked to do to show up. So where do you want overburdened communities, and the question of transmission line siting to show up either in our emerging principles, in our background discussions, or somewhere else. Then we're going to come back to the conversation we began yesterday around the emerging principles around the expediting the environmental review. We took the feedback from both of the breakout groups and we combined them, and we've got very specific things we want to talk to the group about with the hope that we're able to iterate that in real time so that we're able to come out of this meeting with a very clear set of directions on what changes you want to see made. And then what we're going to end the meeting with is around Robin, just to check in where folks are at, where we'd be at the end of meeting number 5, and we're going to be going into meeting number 6. So I wanted to make space for you if there are other things that you would like to tee up. So with that, Kathleen, I'd like to turn it over to you to kick us off.
Thank you, Rob, and welcome everybody this morning. We had a very active day yesterday with our speakers, really talking about that long-term vision of transmission, which we recognize will take many years actually to come to reality, and thinking about how do we position ourselves so that we can implement the emerging principles that we're seeing in order to provide time on the front end of these discussions as to where the transmission lines should go, and what are the best places for those transmission lines. So really to look at the end goal and be able to see that plan emerging in a coordinated way. I really, really appreciate the conversation from the speakers, but as well from our work group members. And I invite you to continue that today, and think about at the not the Red Robin, we're not going there today. The round robin at the end, to really think about sharing with us if there's something that you are uncomfortable with, some missing piece of information, something that we haven't covered in this process, because we are drawing to the close of our meeting. So really do share with us what it is that you think we need to make sure we include before we're finished with the process. So with that, welcome to today's conversation. And I look forward to our presentation from Mariel as well.
Great, thank you. Okay, so if we go to the next slide, please. Okay, so as I briefly mentioned at the agenda review, one of the topics that folks suggested that we spend some time talking about, in addition to the topics that we had yesterday, was the overburdened communities conversation. So as a reminder, we began this conversation in meeting 2, and it came up within the context of discussing peak demand. And we were talking about the importance of thinking about peak demand as the concept of overburdening communities, both having to share the burden of having the transmission potentially travel through their communities, but also how does the grid infrastructure support those communities that are at have the highest vulnerability. What resulted from that conversation was just a single principle that shows up about centering social equity. And none of that other part of the conversation that we talked about showed up in the background findings or anywhere else. So the real question for this group is, how do you want and where do you want the conversation about overburdened communities to show up in our work? We've asked Mariel to share some of her thoughts to get the conversation going. And I do really hope that this is a conversation where you all are providing some pretty direct suggestions on where it should show up in the work of this group. So Mariel, I'd like to turn it over to you and invite you to share some of your thoughts about this.
Certainly. Good morning, everyone, and I'll just reintroduce myself a little bit. I come to this conversation and to this group, to this work body, as someone who has followed CETA, particularly around the rulemaking, and then now looking at the implementation, and I'm quite familiar with the language and the thinking around how utilities have some direct responsibilities for driving an equitable kind of transition towards the 100% emission-free electricity goals in that law. And this work group in particular has been a great learning experience for me because there's the limiting factor in CETA and how kind of it's been interpreted around the obligations for utility stakeholders, and that is who's responsible for who, and really thinking about where the equity considerations come up, and it's defined in the rules, and then in some of the language of CETA, that utilities must ensure that their customers are benefiting from the equitable distribution of, or kind of from an equitable transition, and kind of therefore customer service area is where utilities have sketched out how in planning, in resource planning and other transition operational decisions, they will be understanding and holding themselves accountable to benefit, reducing burdens and increasing benefits, distributing them, and addressing disparities experienced by certain communities, in particular, vulnerable populations and highly impacted communities. And that leaves a lot of other communities sort of at the sidelines, and those being those that are not kind of within the specific territory of utilities who are almost certainly, I mean, I don't know all the details, but the vast majority of utilities here and probably everywhere have significant operations kind of relating to their supply of electricity that don't take place in their service territory. And so this transmission work group and thinking about some of that, including infrastructure build out and just kind of moving power from where it's sourced kind of most efficiently or productively or whatever to where it's being used, is an opportunity to learn and to dig into who can take this on and how, where there can be kind of embedded a system for accounting for kind of these equity goals and centering social equity in the broader vision of a just transition that includes the more expansive transmission, and in general, kind of basically embedding it at every stage of kind of utility scale and basic service provision of electricity. And so I wanted to suggest that we think of how equity principles and particularly obligations, responsibilities, commitments, and promises, and interest and value in ensuring that overburdened communities are not bearing the greater cost, the cost at all of all types and levels of a transition of this very substantial project. I want to suggest that there's different ways to sort of think about it, and I'm breaking it down in 4 parts. And I'm not proposing that this insert itself directly into our emerging principles language and thinking around kind of exactly what needs to be said or stated, but it's more how we can better understand understand what are the concerns. Are there really, yes, there are really concerns, but how can we come to better common understandings about what to do about that? And so kind of the 4 parts, and I'm going to speak to each a bit and hope that this leads to or informs the conversation, which frankly, I feel like at almost every meeting, and I wasn't able to attend every meeting or every minute of every meeting. This was, some of these principles were spoken to or were present, but it's good that we're taking some more time to kind of more directly think about impacts and benefits and burdens for particular communities, and using some more language and more attention to what that means in the context of this work. So for an equitable transition for this electricity transmission, more of it to meet need, with kind of moving towards decarbonized power system. It is broadly kind of knowledge and understanding of what an impact is, who overburdened communities are, their needs, that at the very base, probably a first step at almost every level is kind of recognizing, yes, there are impacts, there are burdens kind of going on that are felt by communities. And so it's a little bit of a shakeup of kind of who the stakeholders are, who's a key entity in this conversation, and what is their power, how are they affected, and ensuring that in small groups, groups with a lot of kind of technical understanding and the majority of the resources to make things happen, and the power and kind of the political power, some of which is kind of represented here, and then certainly all of which kind of controls what's going to happen next. But that definitely does not reach so many of the people who are more directly kind of impacted. And so making sure that central in these conversations and these kind of centralized thinking spaces and planning and budgeting spaces are considerations around how do we learn about kind of who else is out there, what are other interests are directly implicated in this work, and then bring that into planning kind of resource decisions. And an important step then that follows is that planning and what to do, how to actually define distributing benefits, and understanding what are the benefits that are kind of available here, supply side and demand side, everything around the enormous resources that are channeled into large projects, and then who gets those resources in the end, kind of where they fall, and who's not just profiting kind of conceptually, as in able to kind of take advantage of that to build towards sustainable positive outcomes on the labor front, on kind of the kind of infrastructure and assets that are established in communities, and provide kind of beneficial opportunities for communities rather than eyesores or impacting kind of real estate or all of the environmental and health impacts that can emerge from any sort of physical kind of material development. And then so you plan for and then you implement projects around or programs for distributing benefits and reducing burdens. And then what is the accountability? So you get the knowledge, you plan programs, and then you establish at the planning stage, and then certainly kind of throughout the implementation, mechanisms for accountability, which really means clearly defining who the kind of the primary players are and stakeholders are, and what responsibilities they have, and then where the enforcement mechanisms are. There just needs to be accountability. It's not just, you can't just have some programs and then with some good intentions behind them. And then I want to suggest that there's also kind of substantial need to think about governance, which is kind of how power is concentrated in a lot of the decision making and planning for transition projects, for transition, these massive scale types of projects. And this is more, probably at this stage is a bit more kind of conceptual and maybe aspirational. But part of that, and I think incorporated in governance, is absolutely everything around consultation and engagement. But then it is moving more towards power shifting, energy democracy, and ensuring that there is space for and kind of protection of the interests of those who are most directly impacted and often most disproportionately kind of represented in kind of current spaces for these decisions, to move more into those spaces and to have decision-making authority and authority over kind of the resources that are going towards kind of larger projects, and to see this as an opportunity and not as something that could actually just slow things down or kind of impede trying to accelerate targets and meet urgent need. And so that is really kind of a shift in thinking in how a lot of this work happens. But I think it ties to just where we want to be on the other side of the transition. And that is a stronger and more equitable society broadly. And that will, I think, protect all interests in Washington, from economic to social to environmental. So I can take a little more time just to at least set us up for thinking about what is an overburdened community, and sort of that knowledge piece that I started with. I think there are a number of components to it, and part of it is setting the definitions and understanding them, having a good basis for discourse, and continuing to invest in putting really making sure that this is sort of human-centered, and that communities are understood as these are people, and here are the factors, and here's how kind of communities are defined. And so what we have to draw on kind of most immediately and easily is language in the statutes, and CETA does not define overburdened communities, but we see overburdened community language in some other kind of legislation, and certainly that's what we're using with or that's what's coming up in kind of this discussion, how the work group is is considering kind of social equity. And so there's a definition of overburdened community actually in the HEAL Act, or the Healthy Environment for All Act, passed slightly more recently than CETA by a couple years. And that is, an overburdened community means a geographic area where vulnerable populations face combined multiple environmental harms and health impacts, and includes, but is not limited to, highly impacted communities as defined in CETA. And so they points to CETA, but it is a bit more kind of expansive, whereas CETA defines highly impacted communities and vulnerable populations. And I'll just throw those definitions out too, because they broadly cover thinking geographically about how to geo-target specific programs and projects to a place, kind of, or a location where benefits distribution might have the most kind of immediate impact, because it's been pre-identified in a cumulative impact analysis from the Department of Health or the Environmental Health Disparities Map. And so that is actually the definition in CETA of a highly impacted community, a community designated by the Department of Health based on a cumulative impact analysis required under the law, or a community located in the census tracts that are fully or partially on Indian country. And it's defined in the federal law. So that gives kind of very relatively clean kind of geographic parameters to a place where not only is thoughtfulness around benefits, benefits distribution from kind of transition planning, where it can be targeted, but also because the word in overburdened communities is burden. So that's specifically like, okay, not just identifying, some money over here that you throw and call it a benefit. It is identifying where the risks are higher and where the harms are already being experienced at a disproportionately high rate. And so burdens reduction through kind of geographic targeting is kind of really critical in that thinking around who an overburdened community is. And so referring to important resources like the Environmental Health Disparities Map and Cumulative Impact Analysis that came out prior to and were developed further with CETA in mind, it is really critical. And I know that's come up before. I don't remember exactly where, but learning about and applying that tool among other tools when in thinking about finding a community and giving it kind of definition and especially honing in on what burdens are being considered and which ones are most kind of directly associated with kind of these transition operations. And then vulnerable populations. I'll offer that definition too, just because it's a harder one, but it's one that is getting some more definition in some utility-led processes to kind of define vulnerable populations who will be benefiting from the clean energy transition under the CETA requirement. And that vulnerable populations are communities that experience a disproportionate cumulative risk from environmental burdens due to adverse socioeconomic factors, unemployment, high housing, transportation costs relative to income, access to food and healthcare, linguistic isolation, and sensitivity factors such as low birth weight and higher rates of hospitalization. And it is a short list that's offered there, and then many utilities, COUs and IOUs have taken on to expand those lists and really honing in on the different characteristics of communities and of populations of people in their service territory. As I was speaking to earlier, that is where kind of the primary obligations or the equitable distribution mandate on utilities fall. And I've come up with much longer lists for channeling kind of program benefits. And a lot of those benefits are associated with resourcing decisions, hiring practices, and then kind of skills building, moving on, trying to build a skilled workforce, but ensure that participation in these opportunities and other opportunities for in the energy transition are not kind of limited to a certain kind of population demographic or certain area, but in fact is maximally targeted towards and prioritized for communities and for populations who are defined through the assessment processes as more vulnerable, as more likely to be harmed by decisions that either continue to kind of perpetuate disparities where they're excluded from economic opportunities, and decisions around even siting for facilities and infrastructure, or kind of receiving all sorts of resiliency services, even kind of customer programs and stuff. There's a wide disparity in access to those things. So kind of targeting and prioritizing benefits programming to certain communities is kind of really critical in just achieving an equity outcome and moving more towards an equitable process, and just embedding that as a value in how decisions are happening. So by utilities and by everyone else who is involved in and kind of moving on, advancing, kind of funding, approving the different components of how these projects are going to be moving forward. And on accountability, I didn't have that much more to add. I think I could talk, I mean, we could talk about that more in discussion. I just wanted to make sure that that it was said and that it was understood that program planning, that everything that's done on the front end is very important. The understanding of the planning, and then everything around kind of knowledge building related to kind of consultations and engagement. They're very important, but it is a very incomplete picture around equity if there is no accountability, or if it's limited, and if it doesn't really deeply address concerns around actually getting to more equitable outcomes, rather than, I mean, they're just, there are many ways to think about it, but it needs to be present with strong enforcement mechanisms and just holding those stakeholders who are kind of driving a lot of this to a standard, to a kind of a high standard of performance on kind of this principle in particular around social equity. And then on the governance piece, I will invite kind of folks to talk more about that, but I think it is thinking about what's next and what we really want to see for. And one thing we definitely don't want to see is this kind of either or tension that comes up a lot, and it's real. I mean, it's not made up, but something like you can either have really equitable processes where people are highly engaged, where impacts are assessed appropriately, and where there are a lot of opportunities for to be consulted in and to actually be brought into decisions. Or you can have a super efficient, kind of speedy process that is kind of top down, or with just kind of a handful of folks who can make the decisions and impose it on everyone else, and then kind of figure things out later. And I know we are beyond that, like that oversimplification, but I think that we also just kind of need we need the reminder to not fall back into that trap, and especially not to kind of allow that language to reemerge as like a dominant narrative, either equity or affordability, either equity or efficiency. We need both and all. So that was primarily what I wanted to make sure was part of kind of the conversation, part of the thinking on how we move on this, or on how kind of these principles can guide a more equitable application of maximizing benefits to overburdened communities and minimizing burdens. and risks and costs. Um,
Great.
I'm happy to answer any questions, but I think it's just discussion time, right?
Yeah, Mariel, thank you so much. Appreciate that very much. Excuse me.
I will actually say, sorry, Rob,
Yeah,
I
no problem.
can't stick around for the discussion, unfortunately. I have to step away for a little bit, but I can stick around for a few minutes.
Okay, great.
Only, but then I'll have to drop away. So sorry,
Okay.
everyone, for that.
No worries. Thank you. Great. I'm seeing hands go up, and so I'm asking folks to do two things for me. I'm very appreciative of the folks who are putting some thoughts on specific changes into the chat. Please go ahead and do that. Continue doing that. But I'm asking for folks to reflect on what they just heard, and then any suggestions or thoughts about how this shows up in our work. So I've got Kevin, then Katie. Kevin, please.
Great. Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Mariel. Really appreciate your conversation this morning. Just in terms of your experiences in this work, what are some of the things that you think I, as a county commissioner, or anybody really on this group, should be thinking about in terms of how these issues tend to play out in rural versus urban communities, and just sort of what are some similarities, or what are some things that ought to be factoring into our thinking on some of the differences in those communities that may share vulnerabilities, but definitely have different community resources and makeups. Thank you.
Yep, that's, I think there are differences, but a lot of the principles are pretty consistent. As kind of an environmental and climate justice organization and coalition, Front and Center will always be suggesting, like, first, you need to be thinking about community leadership on this. And communities can look many ways. And in rural areas, they can be very diverse. Well, as in urban areas, they can be very diverse between farm worker communities and communities that are just the people who live in rural areas or happen to have maybe second homes or third homes in rural areas. Those who are very kind of invested in revitalizing or sustaining economic and workforce opportunities in rural spaces, but those who are highly concerned about what those opportunities look like and kind of the impact of decisions on around who gets to offer those jobs and what quality of jobs are those. So I think that those are pretty consistent concerns and considerations, no matter where kind of communities are concentrated. But I do think that if you are not, like, there tends to be a bit less or different organization at the community level for groups. And when it comes to questions of labor, I think those are some of the better organized and stronger interests, community interests that are represented in rural areas. And it's not always that well represented. I mean, there are many challenges to that organization. And if you are not in contact, in touch, in connection with, or following community groups where they organize, where they elect leadership, or where they just are drawn towards kind of community-based champions and trusted leaders and spokespersons. I mean, that's a really kind of big disconnect that needs to kind of be prioritized and trying to bridge that, making space for those community interests to be heard, to come forward. But you have to know who holds them, who speaks to them. And that is kind of harder to do in a lot of rural areas, just because the types of organization, they look very different, or they can look very different. But they're there, like, they absolutely exist. Just encouraging creative thinking on that.
Great, Mariel. Thank you. Katie?
Thanks, Rob. And hi, Marielle. I'm really happy to see you here today. That was a great presentation. I hear you on the governance piece. That's something that we're thinking about a lot also. And I pulled up the environmental health disparities map, just out of curiosity, because we had been wondering about something in the emerging principles document that doesn't completely maybe align with what we saw in the energy strategy, the Washington State energy strategy last year. And also with this map, I'm just now looking at some really deep purple around what we would be considering the load area here in Washington. And I'm curious if this is something you've thought about, having environmental EJ considerations potentially, more of an issue near load, whereas these communities have often been where we've cited these emitting projects that we've relied on historically. And that is essentially why they now suffer more of an environmental burden. And I guess I'm just thinking, geographic diversity of resources is good, but also does it get at this point where this map is kind of conveying a disproportionality of burden suffered by folks that potentially, are concentrated around that load area?
It requires a lot of thought, but it also requires a lot of kind of pulling apart what are the kind of the complex considerations in here. And the purple and purple going on red, basically census tracts that are identified as the highest risk. And proximity to kind of more proximity to higher emitting or higher polluting, often facilities and operations is consistent. That was a big part of learning from that. And also just many other factors informed by income level and education level, and a lot of kind of the socioeconomic factors that are appropriately aligned or speaking to kind of why certain kind of places have higher concentrations of vulnerabilities. And I think with the balance of what it means to have kind of power generation and sourcing concentrated or spread out, and then which types of generation, with obviously you don't believe, and then I don't think anyone here, I don't know if anyone anywhere thinks that everything around these projects is bad for communities and therefore needs to be as far away as possible from any place where a human lives or where there might be higher cultural or environmental concern. So it is kind of really parceling out what are the challenges, risks, experiences, and harms in which areas of these, in which of these these areas that are identified as highly impacted, and what's there, what's bad, and then sort of give good, bad, neutral kind of valuations to it. And that's a really kind of oversimplified kind of analysis. But there needs to be, you need to come down somewhere. And by you, I mean the grand you, not just the yous on this call, but in cooperation with community, with the interested communities, kind of determine what are the goods and the bads of kind of the potential kind of facility and infrastructure development, and kind of what are the goods and the bads, the kind of the current and the legacy impacts associated with existing and historic energy features. So I think that might address your question or some of the thinking, but that's a really good point.
Yeah, it's complicated. Thanks, Marielle.
I have to step away,
Yep.
but I look forward to catching up on the recordings and the notes for the rest of this conversation. Bye,
Great.
everyone.
Thank you, Marielle. So I want to invite other folks to share thoughts and observations. And we had several suggestions for specific changes to the emerging principles. Clint suggested a change to one of the emerging principles on centering social equity. Justin suggested perhaps a new principle that could show up in the planning. So I want other people's reflections on this discussion, and then any other specifics on where and how they think this could show up in our work. Yeah, Clint, please.
There's a couple of other places that we talk about avoidance throughout the document, and that might be an area to reference as well, of avoidance because of overburdened or vulnerable populations.
Mm.
And then the third last one would be, I think it was talking about, there was one in there about citing, number 6, citing new generation air load where feasible to minimize impacts that could be added to minimize impacts to overburdened and vulnerable communities. I don't know how many times it needs to be repeated through there, but it at least it could show up in at least one area, but avoidance is part of the areas where it could show up.
Excellent. Thank you, Clint. Katie, then Joe. Katie?
Yeah, so in thinking through the way transmission is being looked at now compared to the way we might be thinking about it if we were to evolve toward an RTO, to being involved in an RTO, I know that shows up in the emerging principles a couple of times, and I'm thinking, I know that the various players in that consideration right now are thinking about what are the governance options at play, and that might be something worth adding to the document. What does governance look like in our options?
Great. Thank you, Katie. I've got Joe, then Nicholas. Joe.
Yes, it's something that Mariel said stood out to me, and that was about engaging with community leadership, and I think that there's an opportunity here to I'm looking at principle number 6. A lot of we have a number of principles here that are specific to the tribes, but maybe we could add something that something like finding ways to not only engaging with community leadership of overburdened communities, but actually trying to think of ways to foster that kind of community leadership. Maybe there's an opportunity for organizations to do that in some way, and really be proactive about fostering that and engaging with them proactively, as opposed to just going out and searching for folks to engage with.
Great. Joe, thank you. Nicholas?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. So one of the things that strikes me is that when you're dealing with transmission, you're often dealing with long lines, and you have different routes you're going to be able to put the transmission in, and you have to kind of figure out what makes the most sense. But with regard to, communities that have historically been marginalized or have desperate impacts, I'm wondering, and I'm not suggesting this, I'm wondering whether it makes sense to have some language in one of the objectives that kind of deals with the balancing, because you may have a situation where you go one path, you have one group that's affected, and you go to another path, you have a different group that's affected. And there's going to have to be some sort of way to think through, okay, how are we going to sort of be as fair and as equitable as possible, knowing that we can't, if you're going to place a line, you're going to have to actually physically put it in. And that means that someone's likely to have it in their backyard and someone else is not. And I don't really have a suggestion on the language, but I do think that acknowledging that, that there are times that's going to have to be trade-offs amongst these type of groups, just because of their location and the points you need to take the power from the source to the sink.
Great. Nicholas, thank you. Other thoughts that folks are willing and interested in sharing with one another? Yeah, Lorna, please.
I was just going to add to what Nicholas said of just as a utility siting to load. I mean, we would always site to load because it'd be cheaper if you could do that, right? You're building less transmission. So just keep in mind the geometry associated, and that's what I think Nicholas is referring to. There's at some level, this is geometry because, again, we try to site least cost resources. And if you don't need to buy transmission, you know what I mean? That significantly reduces costs, or you need to buy less. So of course you would want to site close to load. But when we're talking about a renewable portfolio, you have to site where the resource is. So you have to site where the wind is or where the sun is. So just, again, teeing off what Nicholas said, there's some real restrictions here if we're going towards a clean, highly renewable portfolio where the resources are. So you are just going to have to deal with having to get from point A to point B. And, you know, sorry if this doesn't sound good enough, but utilities, I mean, I think the way we think about it is we're going to make the corridor better if it's an existing corridor. Like, I think existing corridors are always our first thing we would look at. And then we think about how can we improve it, right? And when we think about an existing corridor going through a low income area, right, can we do trails underneath there? Can we enhance it? Can we put more vegetation? I mean, so I think there are ways to think about, I think we always need to look at existing infrastructure first. Always going through a new area is just so much more problematic. But if it's existing, can we make it better without eliminating it? Because we unfortunately do need to get from point A to point B, and the resources just aren't fundamentally available by load or near load, unless, you know, I mean, that's where we're getting away from this fossil where you can move, you know, fossil resources and burn them anywhere. And we really are going to have to accept that we need to go to where the resources are. If that makes sense.
Lorna, thank you. I've got Glenn and Will.
Yeah, thanks. And I think I would extend this point that that Nicholas and Lorna have made a little bit, and encourage us to look at the energy transformation at the entire system level. And I don't mean just the electric system in that. So it's not just, you know, that there are trade-offs between path A and path B with regard to transmission, but that the energy transformation that we envision has direct impacts, certainly when we build a new facility somewhere. It also has very important, but maybe less obvious impacts in terms of displacing the use of diesel and gasoline in transportation. You know, that health disparities map. My impression is that a lot of the purple, the root cause of that is transportation related emissions, and an electrified transmission system can really make a big difference, I think, in those health impacts. And the same sort of thing is true in other sectors too. You know, that industrial hotspots can be addressed somewhat through the use of electricity, but only if we have the electricity. And, you know, so we need to look at ways to deliver that clean electricity, in part because of the environmental benefits. And then I'll just take it one step further, and that is that the impact of climate change itself, you know, the scientists have shown that it is not uniformly the burden of everybody in the world, that it is, you know, disproportionately harming and will do so more and more, harming those who are already overburdened today. And so that is one of the ultimate objectives of the energy transformation itself. And it has such a big impact on overburdened communities that that it's important important that we keep that overall objective in mind when we're looking at individual things like, should we build another transmission line or not? And if so, where? Thank you.
Glenn, thank you. I've got Will next. Will, please.
I just wanted to realize here, I want to point out that when we're looking at this on the economic part with our disadvantaged, lower income people, they can't maybe afford to move a location. And we're talking about affecting them that way, but we also have to keep in mind how expensive these projects are. And in the end, the ratepayer and through rates or taxes is what's funding these projects. So as you move it around, you're going to increase cost, which is going to hurt low income on that end at the end of the day when they're paying their power bill every month or their taxes every month. So you need to keep that in mind as well.
Great. Will, thank you. Other thoughts on this?
I would like to add on to what Will said, but with a focus on tribes, because there are lots of people who do move around, but indigenous people are on the land that they've been on. And that's a different kind of consideration, because we also have to acknowledge that they are on their historic lands, and that's not going to change. So I think that's a kind of an additional consideration to what Will was saying as well.
Great. Thank you, Kathleen. Dana or Dawn or Rob, I don't know if there's anything that you wanted to add on based on what Kathleen just said.
Rob, if that was directed to me, Rob Lothrop. Yep. Thanks, Kathleen. You're right. The tribes and tribal peoples are rooted to their historic lands. Their treaty rights are geographically specific. A Yakima tribal member can't move to Nevada and practice Yakima traditions there with respect to the resources that he or she may have grown up with. So it's a really great comment, Kathleen, and thank you, Dana and Joe, for also kind of reinforcing that tribal perspective. And if we can continue to help inform everybody, happy to do so. Thanks, Rob.
Yep. Okay. Other thoughts? I'm through the queue of hands there. Other thoughts that folks want to share on this? Okay, Kathleen, let me tell you what I think I heard and see if it's consistent with what you heard in terms of how things could evolve based on this conversation. I think what I heard is that there may be some value in inserting a high level kind of background finding or conclusion in the first set of principles that talks about two things. One, what the intent is and definition is, as Glenn described, of the Washington state legislation, where the definitions are, how it's related, and that the relationship of this conversation is a part of a bigger conversation that's going on in Washington state. So I think a background finding that kind of lays out the big picture could be added. I then think that for the principle around that we have on planning on social equity, could use some tweaking based on this conversation that reflects kind of the nuance that we started teasing out. And then I heard potentially opportunity for two additional principles. There seemed to be a great deal of energy around the use of the map and how that map could be a tool that informs the different processes that go on. And then I heard a potential suggestion about looking at those principles where we talk about avoidance and engagement and making sure that those are reflective of the conversation that we had today. So that's what I think I heard, and that's how my notes kind of shook out. Kathleen, does that make sense to you? Anything else that you heard? And then I'll see what folks think about some of those changes that I suggested there.
I do think that's right. I think the consideration of the map has to be in the entirety of the clean energy work, both the placement of facilities, but also the relief of impacts. So, so I think that's tied to the overall CETA work, if you will. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think it does. Yes, I think I understand. Thank you, Kathleen. What do other folks think? Did I kind of capture that the way you heard it as well? Are there things that you want to emphasize, things that you think I missed, shouldn't be in there? I know I'm asking you to not respond to specifics, but we don't. I wasn't able to pull that together for you to give you something specific to react to. So I'm just describing kind of conceptually what I'm thinking. Allison, I saw you flipped your video on. I don't know if that means you want to jump in.
That was a mistake. No, just kidding. So I'm going to be sort of a downer here and saying, 30-something years of working in regulatory, getting a energy company, sometimes even DOT, to avoid a cultural or sacred site is so hard, if not impossible. So under NEPA and environmental justice, if there's any kind of federal piece, the disproportionate impacts on communities have to be considered. The problem has always been it's a process, not an outcome. So getting to the outcome has always been this huge hurdle. We know these places are there, but why can't we avoid them? And then, of course, we get back into, well, it's too expensive, the cost is too high. So it would be great if the day would come when people actually said, oh, I think we'll take that other alternative, or I think we will move this line, 50 feet that way. It's hard. I mean, I get it's hard. It's easier said than done. And sometimes it's private property problems. You can't take somebody's private property, but we do this analysis now in many ways. We just don't have a follow through. So I don't know how we get to a better outcome, not just a better process. Thanks.
I was also, thanks,
thank you.
Allison.
I
I was going to say, reflecting back on what Mariel said too, is she talked about what are so there's, and I agree and hear what you're saying. And then there's also the piece of benefits, who benefits from where the line is located and how can you distribute that differently. And she talked about that play between program benefits and how to distribute them. So I don't know where that fits in, but that may be a missing piece that we haven't quite identified yet.
Thank you, Kathleen. So similar to what we did yesterday, Kathleen, what I'd like to do, if you're okay with this, is maybe see if I can get 2 or 3 volunteers to help modify some of this in between, so that when we get a draft out for the group to look at, it's had at least some group vetting. Would that be okay with you, Kathleen, if I ask for 2, 3 folks to work alongside me and Susan and Joe and Stu on this? Okay, do I have a couple of volunteers? I'm looking for 2, 3 folks. And again, this is probably going to be done via email, like we did on some of the emerging principles. Yes, so 2, 3 folks that want to volunteer to be partners in the pen for implementing some of the changes that we talked about. If you want to just raise your hand, Alt-Y, or turn your video off if you don't want to be considered. I'm just kidding. But I would like 2 or 3 folks who'd want to help me, and I think maybe we will draft Mariel in her absence to perhaps help us, or we'll ask her to join if she's got the time and space available. Do I have any two volunteers? Thank you, Don. I see you. Thank you, Katie. Okay, brilliant. Appreciate you. Okay, so we're going to switch gears. Thank you all so much for that conversation. That was great. It should result in some of the additions that we talked about, and then working with Don and working with Katie, we could see some things that that we didn't explicitly talk about today. What we want to do now is we want to shift gears and talk about the principles around expediting environmental review. What Susan and I did last night is we huddled together and talked about what feedback we got from you all in those breakout groups. And then what we're going to do is we're going to share on the screen a document that has some suggested changes based on that feedback that we got. So what I'm looking to do is, I forgot that I'm the one that's supposed to share the screen, so give me 1 second. What we're going to do is we're going to take the next 60 minutes, however long we need it, to walk through these emerging principles. The process we're going to do is I'm going to share what we heard in the breakout groups, talk about some possible changes, and then I'm going to ask you guys to jump in and say, yes, we need to make that change. No, we should do it this way, to give us some direct feedback about what changes you want to see made, so that at the end of this phone call, at the end of this meeting, we're able to pretty quickly produce another version of this that has your changes reflected. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, great. All right, so for the first one here, align the NEPA and SEPA processes. The feedback that we got from both groups was pretty consistent, that they shared a sentiment that this needed to be a little bit more focused. Both groups suggested addition of some language to the EG statement here. One group suggested that the alignment process didn't only need to be between NEPA and SEPA, that there could be some opportunities to think about alignment just within the NEPA process. So what would it look like for federal agencies to align within themselves? So what we're proposing for this one is the following. That when we talk about alignment with NEPA and SEPA processes, that we're talking about alignment of methodologies for analysis and coordination for the alternative development between NEPA and SEPA, and that the alignment could also happen within and among federal agencies. Susan, is there anything that you want to add on this one before I kind of open it up for thoughts and comments?
No, I don't. Well, yes, apparently I do, because I'm talking. I would say that, again, I think the comment that aligning NEPA and SEPA, just that language was a little concerning. So being able to be kind of specific about what that is in the EG, I think was really helpful there. So I think that was the big piece. And then, yeah, the opportunities for aligning NEPA within NEPA. So federal agencies to federal agencies when it comes to who leads and who kind of decides what NEPA process will be followed.
Great, thank you, Susan. Okay, so what do folks think? Did we accurately capture your feedback from yesterday? And are those changes the right changes? And this whole process is going to be a lot easier if folks are just willing to jump in and say yes or no. It's just going to be more efficient.
I think the way that was just described is accurate, but I don't see the text on the screen reflecting that alignment of NEPA processes and coordination is still over in the comments. Is that okay that that's where it's at?
Yeah, and so, yeah, thank you, Justin, for clarifying. I did not, and Susan and I did not have the change to act. We did not have the time to actually make the proposed language changes. So we're just describing what those changes would look like. And I know that that's an imprecise and imperfect way of doing it, but you're right, Justin. It's not the specific language, changes. I'm sorry. So Justin, the text that's highlighted is still the original language with the exception of what's in track changes.
Okay.
Thank you, Justin. Yeah, Diane, please.
Yes, thank you. So one of the things that we kind of talked about was doing the NEPA and SEPA on a case-by-case basis by project, or maybe doing something that more is a formal process with an MOU or some other approach that would do it at a higher level that then would affect, kind of more the agency interaction. And so I think that's one of the questions is which one of these we're trying to focus on, because you could do both, or, and there might be benefits to that. So wanted to say that was one of the options as well.
Great. Thank you, Diane. Any reflections on what Diane said there?
This is Dawn. I'm just going to jump in. I am not really quite sure. I apologize. I wasn't in the meeting yesterday. So emerging principles, I do not know what that means. There's a NEPA process and there's a SEPA process. So how would you emerge? Just a quick, what does emerging mean? So
Don, what we're talking about is these are just, we're calling them emerging principles because they're the principles that are emerging out of this group that have a statement for NEPA and SEPA. So it's not a specific, the word emerging is not implying that SEPA and NEPA are just emerging. Yeah, Stu?
For background, these are just emerging. Just means in this corridor work group, these are principles that are emerging that may go into the final report, and it comes from the discussions last meeting where there were on big projects that involve both NEPA and SEPA, that when people met together ahead of time and coordinated and made sure they weren't duplicating work, it got better. And that's what was trying to get captured here, was that you can coordinate those separate processes. So for example, SEPA can adopt a portion of through SEPA, you can adopt a portion of a NEPA analysis that's already complete if you agreed ahead of time that would suffice.
Thank you, Stu. Thank you, Don.
Well, as a reader, you're going to have readers that don't know what you mean, like me just now. So is there a way of rewording that? Because it sounds like you're emerging a process as opposed to a principle that's emerging from this discussion.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Don. Yeah, so why don't I just take a moment here to just to quickly describe what's going to happen next with this content. So right now we're working in, we're working two separate documents because they're kind of in different places, but where we're going next is it's not going to be in two separate documents. It's not going to say emerging principles. We're actually going to migrate this into a draft of the final report into that form. And that's what this group is going to see next. And so when we make that transition, Don, it'll be really clear that what we mean by emerging principles, and we may not even carry that language into the final documentation. Stu or Joe or Kathleen, I don't know if there's anything that you wanted to add about kind of that transition from our working documents into a semblance of a draft. No? Okay. Okay, other questions or thoughts here on the first one, the NEPA SEPA? Okay, so for the second one here, again, as Justin pointed out, this is the original language that's up there on the screen. What we heard from the groups is that we needed to modify the language so that it's clear that this is not about the FSEC permitting process, but about pathways. So emphasize that this is about encouraging use of the improved pathway, and that the verbs that we were using, expand and recruit, were not quite the right verbs and not quite what we were trying to imply here. And so what some of the group talked about would be things like perhaps use the word encourage the use of the process, but really emphasize that this is about pathways. The second thing here is that folks indicated that it's important that this doesn't read as if the FSEC permitting process is the only game in town. That it's important to understand that there needs to maintain those pathways that support the local determination if that's appropriate. So what we're proposing is that we modify the language to reflect those changes, that this is about pathways, this is about encouraging the use of this improved process if that's relevant to the applicant. Any thoughts on that? Any other clarifications that, as I characterized your comments and suggestions? Great. So Brendan had the question in the chat. Unclear about how number 2 relates to transmission energy projects. Yes. Is there any suggestions on or any thoughts about Brendan's comment there?
I guess, and I think in our recent legislation in 1812, we've actually clarified a bit the standard for transmission opting in for high voltage transmission projects. I guess I'm beyond that. I'm not sure what Brendan is saying.
Number 2, well, let me clarify for myself what I'm saying then. Number 2 reads like it's more about clean energy projects writ large than about transmission. So I was just trying to really grasp how it related to transmission.
Kathleen?
Yes. First of all, yes, FSEC is one of the places that transmission projects can go to for siting. So, but there are other processes with local government as well. I think Stu has been thinking about an option, because I myself was uncomfortable with mentioning FSEC in this if you were the group I was in yesterday. So I just want to be really clear about that. That I think that talking about looking at better ways to coordinate multi-jurisdictional projects may be the better way to go. And I know Stu has been working on some language on that.
Yeah, Stu, you want to jump in with that?
Yeah, and I don't quite have language. It's more like what you have. This, I think, the idea that we want to get, whatever the language is, it's coming from all the trouble PSE was telling us about last meeting about, we're doing the same thing over and over in multiple jurisdictions. And I think the focus should really be on that. If there is projects that are multi-jurisdictional, that cross jurisdictions, really urging those jurisdictions to work together to create a single venue, one way or another, whether it's FSEC, whether it's on their own, however, but trying to avoid duplication among, get common work for multi-jurisdictional projects.
Great. Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you, Brendan. Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you, Stu. Lorna?
Yeah, I just want to ask Kathleen, and Stu, I appreciate your comment. I understand your hesitation, Kathleen. I guess specifically, without letting a project go to FSEC, without saying a multi-jurisdictional project can be handled by FSEC, even if it's like a smaller voltage or whatever, there are intergovernmental agency agreement processes that we currently have, which we followed in that. Believe me, if you don't think we didn't try to coordinate all the local governments and make sure they can all work together, we absolutely bent over backwards to do that. That is still hard. So if we don't feel comfortable expanding FSEC permit process participation, I think we'll just take this off the list if we don't feel comfortable, and that's just going to be a big problem, right? So because I think I think there needs to be something else then that can handle some of these multi-jurisdictional projects. Or, I mean, again, forgive me, but part of this work group, right, is about how we're gonna be able to pull off all this work in the limited amount of time that we have. So looking at different creative ideas. So I'm just telling you what we currently have is not going to be super effective for siting projects in the time that we need. So if we're hesitant to expand FSEC to handle more kind of transition projects, is there another construct? I mean, I'm just trying to, forgive me, I'm trying to just figure out, like, we can water this down, but if we're fundamentally not ready to do that, maybe we should just take it out, because there are already, go ahead, Stu, sorry.
Yeah, I think, I mean, FSEC is already prepared with the recent legislation to handle more of these projects. I think we just want to make sure we don't want, FSEC doesn't want to be imposing in here that the group says use FSEC more, because we're really saying you use multi-jurisdictional projects. FSEC's one of those. People could come up with other ones as well. But we are, we don't, we have been, our with the recent legislation, our authority has been expanded enough so that we can do these things, I believe.
And Lorna, I hear what you're saying. And I just am trying to find a place where, first of all, it's not on just the proponent to work on a multi-jurisdictional basis, right? So if that's not working in local government, maybe local government needs to do that. They need to take some leadership in working on a multi-jurisdictional process if they want to have success in working on a transmission project.
And I guess, to be fair, I hear you. If I just go back to the simple geometry problem, right? You have to get from point A to point B with a transmission project. And sometimes, I mean, sometimes you're going to need to go through a jurisdiction that doesn't need that power, right? And we're seeing, I mean, like I said, our project that we had, I'll tell you the success of it is that it's needed by all the local people, because at the end of the day, it's more of a distribution transmission project. And I'm sorry if I'm confusing terms for those not familiar with the electric system, but there's two fundamental different kinds of transmission. One is you're wheeling from an energy generation source into a load that doesn't have sufficient electrons to power, right? There's another kind of transmission where you have enough load overall, but a whole bunch of people, let's say, move to one area, and you have enough load total, but you don't have enough to get that load to the one area that has the highest demand. So sorry if I'm oversimplifying, but the project we had was the latter, right? It was fundamentally a distribution project that you needed a transmission line for. And again, I'm sorry for complicating terms, but so in that instance, everyone we went through, to Kathleen's point, does need the project. I mean, they don't necessarily think that, and they were sure that they didn't, and this was something else. But anyway, my point is that the stuff that we're talking about, like what CETA is talking about, is that we are trying to wheel in. I mean, this may be renewables coming in from Montana, Idaho, right? And by definition, by geometry, it's going to go through areas that you can argue and say don't benefit that area. You know what I mean? So I hear you, Kathleen. I just don't know what incentivizes them to work together if it's not benefiting. And my understanding is that was why FSEC was founded in the first place, right? Of when there's a greater state need of how to look at it and consider everything on a whole, right?
So, and on those larger projects, it's going to be federal. They're going to be federal projects. They're largely going to be, have a federal, I believe they're going to have a federal nexus. And so I look at what's the role.
You just cut off, Kathleen. I don't know if you cut off for everyone else.
Kathleen, we lost your volume there. Can't hear you still. Still can't hear you, Kathleen.
I bet you she's solving all the world's problems right now and we're missing it.
Kathleen, we can't hear you.
Yeah, and the fact that it cut in halfway like that, she might need to log back in and log back out again, or, come back into the meeting.
Thank you, Tess. Kathleen, can you hear us? Okay, give me a thumbs up if you can hear us. Kathleen, can you hear us? Tess, can you please chat Kathleen and let her know that she should log back out and log back
I
in
can't
again?
hear either.
Oh, we can hear you now. Can you hear us now?
I gotta
We
fix
can,
She did solve all the world's problems, Lorna, and we missed it. Damn. Kathleen, if you can hear us, I think you need to log back. Stu, do you have her cell number? Could you shoot her a quick text message asking her to log back in and log out, log back in again?
will do.
Thank you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh,
Can you hear us?
I can.
Okay. So Kathleen, we missed everything you were saying in response to, and we figured that you had solved
You know
the
it was
world
great.
problem.
We know it was great.
It
And
was
Kathleen,
brilliant.
and if this helps at all, Kathleen, I hear you. I shouldn't have used the example of Montana, Idaho. Like, let's say there's more Eastern Washington wind projects. Like, maybe throw that out there as an example. Because we haven't triggered federal for some of those, right?
Yes. Yes. So I'm happy with having something said about FSEC. I'm also respectful for local government to acknowledge that it's not the only path available.
Okay, other thoughts on this one? Okay, so what I'd like to suggest, if folks are comfortable with this, is I'd like to suggest that we recast the principle as the emphasizing the importance of looking at ways to coordinate multi-jurisdictional projects, and mention that there are different pathways by which this occurs. That, Kathleen, then maybe that's a place where we mention the FSEC. Okay. Okay. Lorna, does that make sense to you?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. And if it doesn't make sense when we actually come up with a language, you'll have another bite at the proverbial language there. Okay, so what we're going to do is I'm going to get through number 3 here, the next one, and then we'll just take a quick break because we've been at it for about 90 minutes, and we'll take a break and then we'll come back and we'll pick up where we left off here. Okay, the third one here was a suggestion to develop federal and state programmatic agreements to identify possible project category exemptions. So we heard several different things here. The first is that perhaps we need to take do a step before this emerging principle, and that we could perhaps recast this to the need to explore where the opportunities exist to do this both within Washington state and at the federal level first, then look to establish the agreements if the opportunities themselves are compelling. And so jumping straight to programmatic agreements in the absence of understanding where there may be the opportunities to have those categorical exceptions. And then the second note is that there was a discussion around whether the term exemptions is an appropriate term to use. That the concept that we're really talking about here is the concept of advanced planning. So it's not as if they're not going to get a permit. It's just that they're going to meet certain characteristics that they accomplish through advanced planning that allows them to move through the process more efficiently. And so there was a suggestion, again, the possible changes that we're proposing is that that we take this one step back, that instead of immediately going to develop those agreements to explore the opportunities for those agreements, that implies work for exploring what's possible in Washington state and what's possible at the federal level, and then thinking about that term exemptions. So what do folks think? Any Does that accurately capture what you all talked about in your breakouts?
Rob, this is Diane. So I think the challenge I'm having with this is I'm not understanding what we're trying to get to. So are we trying to exempt complete projects? Are we exempting some of the environmental impacts because it's in the environmental impact group? Are you exempting part of the process? What exactly are we trying to get to here? Because I think that would help us maybe frame what we're looking at. Because if there are environmental impacts and you can address those through advanced planning and mitigation, that's one aspect. And I think that's what we talked about yesterday. But if we're looking at complete categorical exemptions, that's a different thing. And that's not just environmental. That maybe moves it to another category as well.
Does anyone on the group want to reflect on that?
Sorry, I didn't mean to have my hands up. This is Lauren, I'll lower it. But since my hand was up, I'll just ask a question. Are we talking really pre-approvals? Like this is like a, you know, like when you qualify for a nationwide and you can say the environmental review was done as part of it because you fall into a certain category, right? The environmental review was done of that category. So are we talking about something where we're saying fundamentally the environmental review was already done or the environmental mitigation was already done? So, you know, exemption is really saying it was already done and it's inherent in what was, is that what we're talking about?
Yeah, that was the origin of this, and the pre-approval is probably more accurate language, Lorna. Yeah, Brendan?
Yeah, I mean, you peaked, but I wasn't here yesterday, so my apologies for that. And I don't want to be coming in here saying these are lousy or anything like that. So better speak instead of putting something in the chat box. The word exemption kind of caught my interest. So maybe if we can tailor it to talk more about programmatic permitting instead of exemptions, that would reduce some concern here. Because I see those as fundamentally different things. Exemptions is more of a regulatory or even lawmaking process where programmatic permitting is about doing the work in advance, and then things that meet those areas where you've done the prior work, you can have a faster permitting timeline.
Great, thank you, Brendan. Allison, please.
So we've done exemptions in programmatic agreements. We have a really large one with DOT. So for example, if DOT is doing what I call a mill and overlay, right? They're chewing up asphalt and putting new asphalt over the asphalt. We don't want to see it. That's not something we need to look at. You're putting in a stop light in the middle of town on a sidewalk. We don't need to see it. Even if it's federally funded, we don't need to see it. We're good. Like, we don't want to go there. So I do think you can do exemptions in agreement because under Section 106, we do it all the time. That way it gives us the opportunity to concentrate on what we need to concentrate and not spend our time on what we don't need to spend our time on.
Great, thank you, Allison. Other thoughts on this one? Okay, so the way that I'm hearing this one evolve is that the notion of stepping this one back a little bit to kind of explore what is possible is still important, but we want to change the language from exemptions to this notion of pre-approval, or I like the term programmatic permitting because it sounds like that has some meaning in the process itself, in that the end goal or the outcome would be, you know, if there are opportunities to look across the different processes to coordinate where that programmatic permitting can occur, it becomes the win-win. Does that make sense to folks? Okay, great. All right, so it is, where's my clock here? It is about 10:32 by my time here. Why don't we take a 12-minute break and come back at 10:45, and we're just going to pick up right where we left off. So 10:45, we're going to pick up right where we left off after the break. We are going to finish going through these principles, then have some time set aside for our go around, and then time set aside for public comment. Tess, if you could please bring up the slide that's got the information for the public that are on the live stream for public comment. If you could please put that up on the screen. We will return at 10:45. Tess, I think I can see your screen.
Well, thanks, Rob. I must have shared my full screen.
Yes, and we are recording and live still, so that's good to have popped that off.
Might do a quick adjust here. One moment.
This is Rob from Ross's 2-minute warning. We're going to get started in about 2 minutes. Okay, this is the 1-minute warning. We're going to get started in 1 minute. Okay, I ask that folks find their way back to their Zoom interface. So if you could flip your video on, give me a thumbs up, or some way let me know that you are back. That would be great. Hi, Kathleen. Hi, Glenn. Welcome back. Thank you. Hi, Brendan. Welcome back. Okay, so for the folks that are following along on the live stream, we're going to pick up the meeting where we left off, and then we are going to come to public comment in about 60 minutes. So I'm going to ask that at 11:45, you do join the Zoom meeting if you're interested in providing public comment. At that time, we will put this slide back up that has the information for how you do that. So Tessa, I am going to take back the screen sharing, and I'm going to put this document back up here. Are folks able to see my Word document? Yep, great, thank you. Okay, so picking back up exactly where we left off here is principle number 4 is pre-screen viable geographic areas for studying transmission prior to project-specific review to focus applications in areas with the greatest probability of permitting success. So the first thing that we heard is that we needed to be more direct about this, and the notion came out of one group that the pre-screen should be done within desired corridors. The second thing we heard is that we should be explicit in here about the expectation for this work and what happens, should it cross jurisdiction. So for instance, it would be useful to know what Oregon thinks the best location is to cross the Columbia River if we're looking to cite something that's coming that goes across the Columbia River. And then the third suggestion was that we clarify that this kind of pre-screening work is not done in a vacuum. The other thing that occurred to me is that this may be one of the opportunities to add concepts from what we talked about this morning with regards to the use of the EJ screen mapping tool that we talked about. So I want to see what folks think. If we're more direct about pre-screening and desired corridors, being explicit about the context for this, so jurisdictional boundaries, and that this pre-screening is helpful if it is done in a more consensus fashion. Yeah, Diane, please.
Yeah, thank you. What I would suggest is that instead of using the word pre-screen, which means that someone is making a decision on something, that we use the term more like the least conflict analysis being done, because that does include communities and all the people that would be involved at the different areas and have the voices being heard through that process.
Great, thank you, Diane. Yeah, and I'm sorry I didn't mention that. I even left myself the note that Susan put in there. So thank you, Diane. Okay, other thoughts on this one? Okay, so
I'm going to jump in real quick here.
Kathleen.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So just in reading in areas with the greatest probability of permitting success, I think one of the challenges there, then we need to include the ensuring that overburdened communities are involved in that conversation, because that's where you can lose the concept of, and I do hear what Diane said about least conflict, but maybe we need to put something in about ensuring overburdened and vulnerable populations are included.
Great, thank you, Kathleen. Okay, any final thoughts on this one?
Yeah, this is Diane. I think that would also be a place where we may want to add tribes.
Tribal consultation needs to be included
Yeah, thank you, Dana. So that's
for the tribal communities are often overburdened by transmission lines crisscrossing their reservations. And then the pre-planning needs to be brought to the table along with the programmatic agreement. Are the tribes going to be allowed to have a seat at the table with the programmatic agreement discussions?
great. Yeah, thank you, Dana. And maybe as the segue to the next one, we have a series of a set of principles that describe expectations around tribal consultation and then tribal engagement. And what we tried to do here, Dana, is number 5 and number 6 here are not project specific. This is about at the full level investing in proactive and meaningful tribal consultation, and then long-term investment in relationship building between applicants and tribes. And then number 7 and 8 are more project specific, is what we tried to do here. So I don't know, Dana, if you have any reflections on 5, 6, 7, and 8 here.
I haven't had time to read it, but I'll take a look at it and you guys could proceed.
Okay, that sounds great.
Okay, thanks.
So the suggestions that we got out of the groups yesterday, a couple of things. So the first is for 5, 6, 7, 8, and for the ones that are remaining here, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, that we needed to make sure that the language is consistent with House Bill 1753 and 1812, and that would be something that we'd want to make sure is reflected in all of these. And then the 2 comments that I wanted to talk to the group about is that someone suggested that instead of the word invest here, that perhaps it's a different word like insure, because if you insuring is stronger than just investing. And then somebody wanted to check in just to make sure that for number 7, that this was the right time frame, 6 to 12 months. They thought that may not be the kind of lead time that some of the tribal participants were requesting. Yeah, Dawn, please.
Did you want comments on those now?
Yeah, that would be great.
So the tribal consultation bill that was passed, we, the tribe that I represent, we and others asked for additional time on increasing engagement prior to initiating the application process.
Mm-hmm.
So if you say consistent, it's probably not going to be enough time because we asked for at least a year, and that wasn't accepted by the governor's office. So is there any way that we can get at least a year in this process, and then the other parts of that bill being consistent, that the engagement be consistent with that process? Because the solar team that I work with at Yakima, we're finding out that agencies are aware of these applicants, way before the tribe is aware of them. And we're hopefully going to get that coordinated so that once an agency is aware, the tribe becomes aware. But that is not happening currently. So, and there's applicant representatives on the call, so they know, how long in advance they know where these projects are going to go. So I wouldn't say at least 6 to 12. I would say at least 12 months prior to.
Great. Great. Thank you, Don. Any reflections of what Don said or other thoughts? That's very helpful. Thank you.
So I have a question. John was talking about 1753, but 1753 is for the climate challenge, for climate related projects. Are transmission lines, will they be able to apply for the climate challenge funding?
Does anybody know the answer to that?
And then let me also add that 1812, where DAP was given another set of responsibilities, actually didn't have a time frame on it.
Okay. So Alison, do you think that for 1812 that any changes, what changes, if any, are you thinking need to be reflected here because of 1812?
Well, I don't think, because 1812 doesn't have a time frame, I think increased engagement, it's not even increased engagement of applicants with tribes. I don't think it's a 12-month issue. I mean, it would be great to have 12 months prior, but it could be 24 months prior. It could be, 6 months. There's no time frame on it.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Maybe it's increase and ensure engagement of applicants with tribes.
And then take out the time frame prior to initiating.
You could say maybe at a reasonable, I wouldn't, we don't have to have a time frame under 1812. It could be 36 months, it could be 24 months.
Okay.
And I know Dawn has her hand raised, so she may have another perspective on this.
Dawn, did you have a follow-up thought, or was that from hand raised from before?
No, that's a new one.
Thank you.
So without a time frame, I don't want the engagement to be part of, or not, I don't want to even use the word afterthought, but what we're learning is that some of the industries are contacting WDFW before we hear of, we being the tribe hears of that potential development. So I don't know if we can point out, once any agency, regardless of whether or not it's part of the executive, learns of an industry potential, that the tribe is also notified at that same time, because the industries know where these are all going to occur, a year, at least a year in advance of them starting an application. And, fortunately, they are also starting to learn that they need to do outreach to the tribe before an application. So I hate to not put a year in, or at least, but at the minimum, once they notify any agency, they need to notify the tribe for an engagement.
Great. Thank you, Don. Joe?
Yeah, just having a little bit of project development experience, I just wanted everyone to realize that there's a big difference between a developer going to an agency and sort of asking about what may be possible, or getting information. That can be very different than proposing an official proposal for a energy project. So I just wanted to point that out, that there's a lot of people who are asking questions about what is possible to agencies without even really having even the financial horsepower to follow through and complete a project. And in my mind, those are two pretty different things. So I'm not sure that the tribes want to be inundated with every single, be notified of every single developer that's calling DFW or anyone else and asking about what's possible. So.
Thank you, Joe. I've got Lauren next. Lauren.
Yeah, it might make, this is Lauren with Columbia Riverkeeper, it might make more sense for one of the tribal government representatives to respond to Joe's comment, but before he completed it, what I wanted to contribute is an observation that I think that's exactly when developers should be connecting with tribal governments. And this is where we've seen time and again where projects get a lot of inertia, agency engagement, and then once it's a pretty baked package that tribal governments are contacted and nonprofits become aware of those proposals. And so I do think it's for the tribal governments to answer the question and reflect on the experience that Joe had, but I just wanted to share my own reflection of what I've seen happen in the past with that the more fully baked stage of a proposal.
Okay, thank you, Joe. Thank you, Lauren. Stu?
Just for framing here, I think that was a great point that Dawn was making about, a real recommendation we could make if people want to do that would be, that as soon as state agencies know, they should make sure that tribes know. I think we might be getting a little confused with like a solar project. We're not doing solar projects. In solar projects, there's like total rookies that are coming and doing these things who don't know who to talk to, and that's creating some problems. But like a big transmission project, like I said, it's going to be 10 or 15 years, and lots, people who've done this before are going to be involved, and we may want to get away from, hearing about it a year, 12 months ahead of time. It's really being engaged that whole time, and things are going to develop. It's going to be just an idea, and then it's get more specific and more specific. And what's important is that involvement through that whole course, timely involvement for all of that at all the different stages, I think.
Great. Thank you, Stu. Okay, other thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I have some more thoughts.
Yeah, Dana, jump in.
I've been involved with transmission lines before my seat, what currently I'm in right now. I've worked with the BPA out at Hanford on transmission projects, and I know the process, the design phase on the location of the transmission lines and the type for the structures. So these projects are designed way in advance of the permitting process. So at that time, these companies can reach out to the local tribal communities or tribal council for consultation. So advance notice would be the best avenue to proceed forward.
Great. So I don't have any proposed changes yet. I have to think through what we had talked about today, but I think I hear what folks are saying, that we got to make sure that these are reflective of transmission projects which have their own flavor, in that the key nugget that we want to make sure that we emphasize is that there is timely and early engagement, and kind of how that's reflected in the language changes. I have to think that through a little bit, so I'm not going to propose any specific changes now, but that's how I'm hearing that this needs to be modified. Does that make sense to folks, Lorna?
Yeah, and I just had a question. I think you summed it up well. because where I get stuck a little bit with what everyone said, I agree, is that, I mean, it's a no-brainer. Applicants should, I mean, they don't have a formal consultation requirement because that by law comes from the agency has that, but they absolutely should be interacting with tribes, you know, if they think they're going to cite a project there. I mean, I know when we've done wind stuff, I mean, that's almost part of the due diligence, right? Like if we think that there's tribal impacts, talk to the tribe before you even think it's a viable project, right? So I think if you somehow word it, I think it's good to encourage applicants. I mean, how do I say this? Any savvy applicant should be doing that, but I think it's good to encourage it. And I think that sets up, I think the agency you apply for permits from is in a much more difficult spot if that applicant hasn't kind of done any voluntary reach out, right? Because they absolutely have to, you know, they have to fulfill their consultation requirements. So it's this, you know, it's kind of encouraging the applicants, but then the state has to do that. I mean, so if this is all about streamlining, yeah, if applicants do their job and up front and encourage them to do that, it'll make it easier for the state. Am I making sense? That's why it's kind of a
that's great, Lorna. Thank you. Great. Okay. So I do want to move on in the interest of time. We're about 15 minutes. Let me check my agenda here. I think we have about 15 minutes left before we want to get to the go round. And so the next place here that we spent some time talking about was increasing funding to tribes and DAHP to reduce staffing constraints. In the groups, there was an emphasis that it was, again, important just to make sure that we tied into the current funding sources, and to be clear that this recommendation is not a one-time recommendation, that this is a long-term recommendation and could specify the kinds of funding. And then in Allison, I'm just going to put words in your mouth here, and so I'm going to invite you to correct them. But Allison had also mentioned that the term resources was not a good term to use within the context of this, because this is a specific acute staffing issue. And so Allison, I don't know if there's anything that you want to add there.
No, I think that's perfect, because the word resources is a pretty generic pablum term, and what we and I know that the cultural group at Yakima, because I talk to Jessica Lally all the time, I know what's needed are humans. We need more humans to do the work in the offices, and I think the term resources isn't clear enough. We need staff. We don't have enough to handle the workload.
Great.
Neither the tribes nor the state. And as I was saying to the group yesterday, the federal government recently just gave tribal preservation offices an increase of less than $2,000 an office, which I found insulting and somewhat horrific, considering the workload they are asking both the tribes and the state to do on cultural resources. So all of these projects are going to get jammed if both our agency and the tribes don't have the staff to do the work. I mean, you can't streamline unless you have humans to help you streamline. So that's what this is about.
Thank you, Allison. Okay, other thoughts on number 10 here? Okay, for number 11 and 12 here, so the ones that I have highlighted, I know the numbering is a little funky because of Microsoft Word. We didn't have any comments from one of the groups on this, and then the other group didn't quite get to 11 and 12. So I just want to open it up here. If folks have any thoughts about number 11 there, approach expediting the first goal of avoiding cultural resource impacts, and then the second there for look for the win. So do folks have any thoughts or comments on these changes that they would like to see made? Yeah, Lorna, please. Oh, and if that's not from your hand up from before, I just noted.
Sorry, I didn't lower it before, sorry.
No problem, thank you.
I have a comment on this.
Yeah, Dana, please.
If avoidance is not possible. Recently, in the past few years, there was a project on the Columbia River called the Big 80 Project. Allison knows about this. And that was a cultural site where it was damaged, and the project tried to proceed, but the Yakima Nation stopped it. So this needs to be clarified for a better understanding on how on that avoidance not possible.
Great, thank you, Dana. Other comments on these? Okay, so moving on to the best practices here. We got just a couple of comments for clarifications here. And so what I'm going to do here, I am going to time box this. So we've got about 7 of these. And so I want to spend about a minute or two, no more than 2 minutes on each of these, just to make sure that we are explicit about going through this, even if we don't have anything to say about it. So there were no comments that received on this first best practice about standardized project names. Anyone have any thoughts on this one? Okay, so maybe just to simplify this process, I'm going to give folks 1 minute to take a look at this entire, maybe 1 minute just to read through this entire list if you hadn't read it before. And instead of forcing you to march through each of these, if you all have any comments that you want to get to, the comments that we have here that came from the group that Susan was running are comments that we're just planning on making changes to. And so if you have any reflections on that, so I'm going to give folks just 1 minute to take a look at this, and then you tell me if there's something specific that that you want to talk to the group about or suggest changes to. And I just want to recognize that this is a very tedious process to go over in Zoom, and I appreciate everyone's ability to follow along and to do this. So thank you. At 30 more seconds. Okay, so Joe, I see your comment in the chat. We did have a better term, but I don't remember what it was. But we can make it consistent, whatever that term was. Other thoughts here that anything that folks want to highlight and talk to your colleagues about? Okay, great. Let me tell you what I think the next steps are, and then Kathleen, I'll see if any final thoughts on the next steps. So we are going to take all the awesome feedback that we got from you yesterday and today on these documents, including the suggested changes that we just walked through here and the suggested changes from the discussion on overburdened and vulnerable communities, and we're going to iterate this content. And we're going to iterate it, and we're going to migrate it into a report format. So the next time you see these, the next time you see the content that we went through today, it's going to look different in two ways. One, the language is going to change based on your feedback, and then the format is going to change to be reflective of what it's going to look like in a final report. Our next meeting is in June. And so we're going to try to give you as much lead time as we can in having to process some of the changes in that information. The pacing factor for that is two things. First is we've committed to working with some of you in between to help us craft some of that language. So that's going to be a little bit of the pacing factor. And then the other pacing factor is there are other parts of the report that we want to draft that are more contextual and descriptive parts of the draft that are going to sit on top of and around this. So description of what the process looks like in that. And so I would anticipate that we would have something for this group to look at in 2 to 3 weeks, and that will give you 1 month with some of the content before we reconvene in June. So Kathleen, anything else that you want to add in terms of next steps here on principles in our content? Okay, cool. All right, so I thought that we would share some of the next steps. So and expectations, that would be a good lead in. And let me stop sharing here because we've now kind of moved seamlessly, I might add, as the facilitator into the next session on round robin, red robin. And so what we're hoping to do, and we've got about 30 minutes set aside here before we have time for public comment, is we just wanted to make space for you all as TCWG members to share with one another, what's on your mind about this process. Are there places where you're uncomfortable? As Kathleen said in the opening today, would be good to hear places that you want to see the group go in the next, over the course of the next 6 to 8 weeks and into the next meeting. How are you feeling about the process? How are you feeling about where we're at? So I really encourage you all just to jump in and share. I just want to say that that I feel as if when Susan facilitates these meetings, you guys all share your thoughts, and that when I facilitate them, these round robins are like 5 minutes. So don't leave me hanging like that. So I just want to hear what folks have to say and where you all are feeling, what you all are feeling, and where you think we're at. And so please feel free to just jump in or raise your hand, and then we can set up the queue.
So this is Allison. I would say that it's always hard to say until these kind of planning meetings are actually implemented, because I'm always curious to see how we're going to, when we implement them, do people follow them?
Yeah.
I mean, I love the planning, and I would hope that it turns into actual implementation, but I'm gonna wait and see.
Thank you, Allison. And I'm going to come back to that thought. If we don't have, if we've got a pause in the round robin, I want to make sure I give folks a chance to share their thoughts. But are there things that this group feels are important to do, or signals to send? We could put time frames around the principles, things that would imply a greater sense of accountability. But that would be the kind of conversations that we could decide to have in meeting 6. So thank you, Allison. So other thoughts? How are people feeling? Where are people at? Don't be shy.
I'll just jump back in, Rob, and say accountability was a good word, and I think that's where I was going.
Yeah, so maybe Allison, just to spur the conversation, not stir the conversation. Do you have any thoughts on what this group could be thinking about or talking about to support that question of accountability?
I guess the question is for Kathleen and others is, do you take some of these principles and actually put them into law? Or do they become a set of rules under an existing piece of legislation? You know, how do we get people to take all this work and implement it and be accountable for it?
Yeah, Brendan, please.
Yeah, let me find my buttons here. Yeah, good question, Allison. What does one do with these recommendations? I mean, I'm intrigued by the overlap and interconnection of this group focusing on transmission with our clean energy siting study, wherein we're charged with coming up with recommendations for improving the process. And there's kind of been a big change, adding a suite of projects that could be going through FSEC. Pretty intriguing. At the same time, it's something new, and there won't be time to see the results of that new change within the time this current time frame that we're dealing with. So where there are themes from transmission line focus that are more broad, my ears kind of perk up, and then, without sounding grumpy, trying to tease out whether or not I'm hearing things that really are actually about transmission lines, or is it things that are actually apply more broadly to other things, and trying to separate those two. So I know that was a little rambly, but there you go.
Thank you, Brendan. Dawn, jump in.
Yeah, I agree with Brendan. It's been difficult to figure out, I know that this group is looking at that transmission corridors, but you bring in the environmental justice part of it, you bring in the consultation part of it, and ultimately permits are going to get issued either by FSEC or the feds. So I'm thinking about accountability, the conditioning of permits to make sure that those entities that are issuing the permits have a way of monitoring that accountability or even enforcing it. To me, I'm not sure where that gap, those gaps exist, and I think they do exist. And then how do we address accountability through enforcement? So, and that I think of the permit process and the ultimate conditioning of a permit, have certain steps been followed, and if they're outlined or at least referenced in the permit, then the agency granting the permit then has some enforceability on the permit. Otherwise, are we just talking about volunteer steps? I mean, goals, guidelines, that sort of thing. I mean, if we're doing that, then you just hope for the best. At least in my mind, that's what happens. You hope that the guidelines are being followed, but I think it comes down to when the permits are issued, there's got to be some accountability of steps being followed and on into the future, pre-application and then the execution of the permit.
Great. Thank you, Dawn. Other thoughts? Kathleen, are there specific places or things you want to explore with folks? Specific feedback
I
you
really
want as
do
a chair?
think the accountability piece is critical, and I thank everyone for bringing that up, as well as the distinction between. And I think it's really hard to focus on the transmission and perhaps the significant level of transmission project we're talking about in this corridor group versus the myriad of clean energy new projects. And I really appreciate that we have perhaps muddied that a bit, because there are consistent principles across, but maybe what we need to do is really scrutinize our principles to make sure we are talking about the transmission corridors as opposed to all projects across that spectrum. That would be one thing that we could do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. Thank you, Kathleen. Okay, so what I'm going to do, we've got about 15 minutes left here. So I'm just going to zip down the list here, and I'm going to ask folks. I'm going to call your name, see if you've got anything that you want to share in terms of where you're at. If you don't have anything to share, totally okay. Just say pass, or if you want me to come back to you, you can. So I'm going to focus on the folks that we haven't heard from yet, and so. In the interest of transparency, and so you can prepare yourself, as I'm just going to zip down the list as it shows up on my participant list. So those are the poor souls that show up towards the top of the list of the ones that are going to be called on first. And so I just want to check in. Anders, did you have anything that you wanted to say in the go around here? Okay, not hearing anything. Lauren, anything to add?
Which Lauren, Rob?
Lauren T, I'm sorry.
That's okay. I was just sitting here thinking, have we really addressed true costs of transmission line? And and this is slightly out of my lane, so bear with me. True cost, but also thinking about the previous discussion on environmental justice, we think about it in terms of what's already on the landscape, but in many cases, and I'm thinking broadly about lots of different projects, create their own disparities because of the potential to lower values in the community and that kind of thing, and people get drawn to that. And so, connecting those two about really understanding what the impact is and mitigating that ahead of time. We also have, what's already existing there, particularly with tribal resources and that sort of thing. But there's other things in the future that certainly will be impacted.
Great, thank you. Glenn, anything to add? Any thoughts you want to share?
I'll circle back to the idea of overall systems approach that I've talked about before. And one thing that I would share is that in the state energy strategy that we produced a little over a year ago, we looked at energy transformation with and without an expansion of the transmission system. And the big difference in those two futures is a lot more development of renewable energy projects within the state. Kind of, if you can't reach those sites in other places, and you need the electricity to fuel our transportation system and other things, then you got to develop more in the state along the existing lines. And so even if we can look at a transmission project and see some negative effects of that, I feel like it's important that at the same time we look at the effects of not building that transmission line and how that would, the requirements and burdens that would place on resources within the state, land resources, cultural, environmental, et cetera. So it's just kind of a systems point that really came out to us in the state energy strategy. And I'm reminded of it as we discuss this today. Thank you.
Great, Glenn, thank you. Julie, anything that you want to add at this point?
I don't know if you noticed the comment I had in the chat about the pre-application process. I think Joe was asking about a better word for pre-screening. That's just something City of Ellensburg utilizes, a pre-application process, and it's kind of a level setting thing for all for the applicant in particular, and that may be something that's useful of setting those timelines, those expectations, and knowing all of the places that you need to engage and ask permitting process, requirements, all of those.
Great, Julie, thank you. Justin.
Right. Yeah, I think my only thought is, it'd be great to see these docs that we've been working on today and yesterday. As you know, I switched roles into the primary spot for WashDOT after meeting 3. So I just know there's some other folks at my agency that would maybe want to take a look at this from their perspective. So yeah, looking forward to that and appreciate the opportunity.
Sounds great, Justin. Thank you. Katie, anything?
I'll just say that I think we are walking away with some solid emerging principles that, are obviously in draft form, but I think there are lots of ways to proceed, including the policy route. These recommendations will go to the legislature and the governor's office, and a lot of exciting things may come from that. But I also think there are some good principles here that can help to build a study that, for example, Chair Decker was talking about yesterday, to really understand what we need and under what circumstances we would need different amounts of transmission and where, and how the cost allocation would work. So just looking forward to taking these principles and applying them to studies to help us better understand what we need. Thanks.
Great. Katie, thank you. Lauren G.
I think I've been called up since second grade. Thank you. No, I don't have anything to add. It's been a great conversation. I appreciate joining in. I'm to step in for my colleague, Aaron Saylor. I would just reiterate the comments earlier around, the ultimate effectiveness of this work group's time and energy, in my view, is whether this is put into statute and rule. And so look forward to that future effort, and we'll be advocating for that.
Great. Thank you. And before I move on, next, I'm going to be coming to you, Lorna. But before I do that, Tess, could you please put up on the Zoom the slide that has the information for the public comment period, so folks are able to do that. We're going to be coming to public comment in about 10 minutes-ish. Okay, next, Lorna.
I don't have much to add. I think we've talked through a lot of great issues. I wish we could be in person, face to face, because I think my takeaway, these are super hard. I hear Glenn. I mean, it's just what we're trying to do is really hard. So I just look forward to just getting to know each other better and working more. And hopefully it'll be face to face one of these days.
Great. Thank you, Lorna. Dawn, did you have anything else to add?
No, I don't have anything at this time. I'm anxious to see, language from the documents that are developing.
Okay, great. Thank you. Will, anything to add at this point?
I don't have much. I just wanted to state I agree with Kathleen's last point about, trying to focus on what we can do to, for lack of a better word, streamline the process, but still meet everybody's, individual goals and their concerns. But the goal is to try to, keep the lights on and meet this demand and be prepared for all this renewables and green energy to be implemented. And, this is key. without the transmission lines there, it's all falls apart. So, thanks.
Great. Thank you, Will. Anders, coming back to you. I don't know if you had anything to add. We weren't able to get you off of mute last time.
Oh, hi, it's Anders. No, I didn't have anything to add. Just
okay.
I support what's in the document so far.
Great, thank you. Brendan, anything else?
No, nothing else.
Okay. Diane, any other thoughts?
No, thank you.
Okay. Allison, any other thoughts? Okay. Joe, anything else? Anything that you wish to share here of the go round?
Not really. I just really appreciate everyone's participation, and it seems like it's been a great couple days. Thank you very much.
Okay. Stu, anything?
Sorry, I was frozen there. No, again, just what Joe said. Thank you so much, everyone, for your participation and your what you're bringing here. I think we're really gonna have a product. I guess I really appreciate the comments about, hey, it's just got to get enacted in law, because I think people should really be thinking about that, of what, how we cast these recommendations. Which ones are recommendations to the legislature for laws, which are to private bodies of what they should do. That's part of our, I think that's part of our challenge is how are we directing these recommendations, and who are we presenting them to? So I hope people can be thinking about that as we move to the final meeting.
I guess I'd also say that even if there's some things that we've discussed that don't get to the point where they get enacted to law and such, there still are best practices that I think potentially your organizations or the organizations you represent can still integrate into your everyday work, and should remember that as well.
Okay. Kathleen, any thoughts that you wish to share?
No, I'm taking in the comments here as I have through the past couple of days, and I think provide us with some directions to go as we review the comments and focus those for the next meeting. So appreciate it from everybody.
Okay, so it feels like we're kind of at a natural stopping point here, but we're running 5 minutes early. And so what I'd like to do is I just want to, maybe we can just take a quick 5-minute break here. I really want to be respectful of the time expectations we set on folks to provide public comment. So I don't want to move into that early because we've been announcing that it's going to begin at around 11:45. So for the folks that are on the live stream, we're going to take a very brief 5-minute break. If you're on the live stream, please go ahead, and you're interested in providing public comment, please go ahead and log into the Zoom meeting. And in about 5 minutes, we're going to make space to see if there's anyone who's joined us to provide public comment. And following the public comment, we will adjourn the meeting. Kathleen, anything else before we do that? Just take a quick 5-minute break. Okay. All right, 5 minutes at 11:45. We're going to come in, see if there's any folks that are interested in providing public comment, and then we will adjourn the meeting. So 5 minutes, everybody. This is the 2-minute warning. We're going to get started in about 2 minutes. And Kathleen, it looks like we do have one person in the waiting room. So when the time comes, we're going to let them in. And we do have someone who is going to join us for public comment. So we will get started in 2 minutes. Okay, I'm going to ask that the TCWG members please come back to your Zoom. Susan, why don't we let the person in from the waiting room? Okay, so we've reached the time. Oops, no, he's not on audio yet. So give me just a second here. Okay, we have reached the time for public comment. It looks like we had one individual join, James Thornton, for public comment. So James, I invite you to please go ahead and unmute yourself, and you have 2 minutes.
Am I on
Yep,
audio
James.
now?
Yeah, we can hear you loud and clear. James, we heard you, and so please feel free to jump in.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, because I'm not seeing any audio or visual. Okay, yes, my name is Jim Thornton. A little bit of my background, I have almost 50 years experience in environmental planning and regulatory permitting. Some other experience, 15 years with the Washington State Department of Ecology in kind of the SEPA section in those days. And most of my experience has been in linear projects and energy projects from East Coast to West Coast, North, South, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Florida, Massachusetts, Washington, California. So a lot of experience in linear projects. And I've also been a consultant for FSEC, and I've been a consultant for applicants applying to FSEC. So a lot of experience. And I live here in Olympia, Washington. So I just wrote down a lot of notes during the meeting, and I apologize, I haven't been in all the meetings. So I haven't heard all of the conversation, but yesterday and today I was online. And I just wrote down some notes. One of the things I've noticed is in your entire group, I know there are some people like Lorna, who I know, I don't really see a lot of actual practical experience in permitting of linear projects, transmission lines. I mean, there is a lot of detail that goes into this, pre-planning, through the process. I managed a $50 million linear project. We had 30, 40 people in the field for 2 or 3 years, tribal interaction over 5 states. And I have not heard anyone who has actually had hands-on practical experience in permitting either a transmission line or a pipeline. And so I think that would have helped in this conversation. And I apologize if there are people out there who've had that experience and I just missed you, but that's what I noticed. Another thing that I noticed, there is no representation of private transmission developers. Mr. Hardy mentioned one that's planning a HVDC transmission line from eastern Oregon down the Columbia River, has a couple upland areas, and then going into the Portland area. But there are other private developers. I'm actually representing one that's looking at a project in the state of Washington. Again, very early planning, and I apologize to the tribal interests that we have not reached out to you, but we hope we will. And it's a $3.5 billion transmission project they're looking at. We're also looking at another transmission project,
Jim,
which will basically go from the Columbia River to San Francisco.
Jim, this is Rob.
An HVDC transmission line capable of 1,500 to 2,000 megawatts. There's a lot of planning going on, and you, I think, should have included private developers who have a lot of interest in privately financing transmission lines. So I don't see any representation of kind of from their interests on this panel.
Jim, this is Rob.
And by the way, my comments are just as I wrote them down, so it's kind of a
Jim,
free flowing here. But
Jim, this is Rob.
Discussion about avoidance of economic, environmental, and cultural impacts.
Jim, this is Rob.
Factored into a planning process. However, there's also a lot of actual
Jim, this is Rob.
Design and engineering that has to go into it, and I've not heard any discussion about those considerations. The Bureau of Land Management has a very good 3-day training program on
Jim, this is Rob. Jim, can you hear me?
Environmental siting of transmission lines. I've been through that training, and it is excellent. And part of that training is in many private.
Jim, this is Rob. Can you hear me?
Have software to do just transmission planning, which includes.
I don't think he can hear you, Rob.
Environmental, cultural.
So for the members of the TCWG,
tribal.
If he's not wrapped up in 30 seconds, I'm going to mute him.
In siting of transmission lines. And I've heard no discussion of these methodologies, which are out there. And
Jim, this is Rob.
Some of them are proprietary and some are more public, but I have not heard any discussion about these software that can do transmission planning.
For the members of the TCWG, I'm going to mute him and Tess and
totally
Susan, can you please send him a message and let him know that we muted him? And if he's interested in providing written comments, he can do so at the email address.
BLM.
Okay, Kathleen, I think we are it. I apologize everyone for how I handled that there. I probably could have been a little bit more stringent with the messaging, but it sounded like we were having a communication issue there. Kathleen, any final thoughts before we adjourn?
No, we welcome people to provide written comments to us, to the work group, which will be shared. And this has been a very productive couple of days, and we look forward to our next meeting in June and a lot of interaction between now and then. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Kathleen. I appreciate you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.